Hello, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to our first talk of our AI in Education series. My name is Patrick Buckland, and I just want to introduce our speaker today. But before I do so, the way we're gonna work it is if you have any questions, put them in the chat. And what we'll do then is at the end of Loretta's talk, then I can ask the questions. So feel free to write down your questions in the chat, and we can go and do that. So just to introduce Loretta, Dr. Loretta Goff is the Academic Integrity Officer in University College Cork. And Loretta is, what she does there, she develops and delivers training on academic integrity and responsible use of generative AI for staff and students. She led the AI2Ed project, producing the toolkit for ethical use of Gen AI in learning and teaching. And also in late in 2024, herself and Dr. Sarah Thelen received the inaugural Sattel Impact Award in Academic Integrity. And she's also a member of Ireland's National Academic Integrity Network, or NAIN. So just I want to pass her on to you now, and she can begin. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for inviting me to give this talk. I'm just going to start sharing my slides there now. Okay, so introductions have been done, so I'll just go on to the next bit. So when I was thinking of what to kind of deliver in this talk, as it's kind of the introduction to AI, can be quite a broad area. I went back and referred to something that our National Academic Integrity Network produced last year, which is actually 2 years ago now, which was the Generative Artificial Intelligence Guidelines for Educators. And within this, it's broken down into categories of kind of what everyone needs to know, what program managers or institutional leaders need to know, what educators need to know, and what students need to know. So looking at kind of what educators need to know, 3 of the 6 items all relate to assessment. So that will be part of what we talk about today. But there's also other aspects around understanding the different types of tools, capabilities, and limitations, and also the values of academic integrity and kind of partnering with students in these. So that's one aspect I'm going to refer to a bit throughout the talk. Also, on the other side of things, I'm also working on another Sattel project at the moment, which is Gen AI Learn. And this project is all around co-designing a resource hub with students, for students, on kind of key aspects of what they need to know to use generative AI responsibly. And I've decided to structure this talk in the same way that resource is being structured. So what to know before you use generative AI, what to know when you use it, and then what to know about generative AI and assessment and academic integrity. So I'm not going to cover everything that will be in that resource hub. I'm going to kind of give an overview of kind of key points of things that we all should be aware of kind of in this new generative AI world. I'm aware that future seminars in this series are going to go into more detail on topics of academic integrity and assessment. So I'm kind of just giving overview and some examples of that today to give a sort of well-rounded look at key things to know. So I'm going to have examples later on in some of the sections around different types of uses in the later sections. And I also have a few bits where I'm going to include some kind of information we gathered from staff and students at UCC in surveys that we did here with them around generative AI use and perceptions to illustrate some of the points as well. So just getting started then, we'll start with what to know before using generative AI. And in this, we're going to look at kind of a little overview of different types of tools and also then the ethical considerations of using them, which in discussing these things will kind of inevitably demonstrate a bit of how they work, what their capabilities and limitations are without going too in depth into all of that specifically for each tool. So the first thing starting out is types of tools. So we don't all need to be experts in generative AI, but it is good to be aware of what's out there because it is so widespread and because it's becoming increasingly integrated into other platforms and softwares. So this is an overview. There's thousands of tools out there. I think there's even a site, there's an AI for that has lists and lists that keep growing of different types of tools that do all different types of things. But these are some of the maybe more well-known or bigger tools that are out there. So first we have the kind of general LLMs. So these are large language models that are kind of general purpose. They're what you would commonly know is that you'd have the conversation with, the chats with. So ChatGPT is probably one of the biggest ones of this. But then we also have Copilot, Gemini, Claude, Perplexity, DeepSeek, the newest one that has come out of China. And these are kind of common, again, general purpose. We're using them for all different types of things. Then there are tools that are maybe more specific to research, perhaps creating literature reviews or identifying sources, mapping these out, taking notes on these, storing references, those type of things. So you see a list of some of those there. Then there are tools that are more focused on either image, video, or audio creation. So again, we have a list there. And then language and translation is another area that there are kind of specific purpose tools. And you might be familiar with Grammarly now has AI built into the advanced version, Grammarly Go. Quillbot, which we might have known as that kind of paraphrasing tool previously, again, has more AI built into it now. And DeepL is one that is used specifically for translation purposes. Now, general tools like ChatGPT and Copilot can also do sort of tasks that are under these other categories, but they're not as specifically oriented for them. And as you might note, so these are all the different tools, and that's kind of what the interface is that you're working with. But there are models then that are behind these tools. It's what they're running off of. So for instance, ChatGPT, you might have heard of GPT-3, GPT-4, and some of those models are used across several or different of the tools. They're all run off of the same model. So Copilot, for example, uses GPT to run. And so you can see there as well, DALL-E and Sora under the image and video audio section. You'll see the same logo as ChatGPT. That's because they're all part of the same company, OpenAI, that does all of them. So even within ChatGPT, you can get it to kind of create images that will use some interface of DALL-E to do that. But this is, again, if you're using for specific purposes. The general idea of this is just to show the kind of breadth of what is out there and that you can kind of create all sorts of things with all sorts of different tools in different areas. So there's very few things, I suppose, that they're not touching these days that they can't do something for. Now, the tools themselves are not inherently good or bad. They're tools. The way, they can be used well, they can be used poorly, they can be designed well, designed poorly, they can be used for good or bad. That's why it's important that we're kind of looking at and talking about responsible use when we're looking at them. But there is no, I'm not advocating or not advocating them in this talk. It's just to kind of give an overview of what we need to be aware of with them. So that's the general kind of intro to different types of tools. So what are some things that we need to be aware of when we're using these? So the first thing is access and equity. So a lot of the tools I've showed you there in the previous slide have both free and paid versions. And free versions, of course, we can all access, but these can be limited sometimes in terms of their training data, or perhaps, so they might be limited up to a certain time period, or you might have a limited number of prompts that you can do in them, so forth, things like that. Whereas the paid tools generally will have more advanced responses. They might be running off of more advanced models. So they can do different types of requests. They can be a bit more customizable. You can create your own kind of chat agent within them, and so forth. So this has the potential then to create another kind of version of a digital divide of those who are paying for access versus those who are using the free tools, which is something to bear in mind in terms of education as well. And thinking about if we are using these ourselves or with students, is there a tool that is provided by the institution for everyone, that there is a certain level of equity for that? I know we have Copilot here at UCC built in, but it's the basic version. I think probably most Microsoft institutions will have access to that basic version, which does have, the ability to do certain things, and it does protect the data within the enterprise. But there are also paid versions of even this, so Microsoft 365 Copilot, and the costs can be quite high. So it's $30 per user per month for that, which if you think about supplying that across a whole institution will add up a lot. And that is one that then integrates into all of the different Microsoft apps and platforms and gives that ability to create agents to do tasks and so forth. So that's one thing to bear in mind, I suppose, in using these, thinking about what level of use are you using, what do you have access to, what might students have or not have access to, particularly if you're thinking about building it in and integrating it into part of a course, thinking about what they do have access to. Okay, the other one is bias. So you can see generally here kind of how these tools are functioning as you put in your input or your prompt. It goes through the model, which has the training data, the algorithms, and then it comes out as the output for you. So I've left that training model as a black box because that is what it is essentially for most of these big companies. They're not necessarily transparent about exactly what has gone into that. So we don't know exactly what it's been trained on and how it was trained, what kind of parameters were set with that, guardrails might have been set. And we also don't know what hasn't been included in that. So, but we do generally know, I mean, a lot of these tools are scraping data from the internet. So that has been produced by us. People have inherent bias, and this is then picked up in the tools. So it's not that the tools have been trained to have any particular bias, but they are picking it up from that content and information that they're being trained on. So based on this, then they do have, gender, racial, cultural bias, language bias, and so on. All of these are within that. So this is just something to think about when we're using them and we're using the information from them, that we're not perpetuating and kind of amplifying this bias by going around in a loop with it. It's also important to think about here that bias is, what it's trained on, but also what it isn't. So for example, there might be kind of local culture, local plant life in a particular area that's maybe not widely, information on it isn't widely available online, and therefore that hasn't become part of the training, and therefore users in that area can't really use these tools effectively for their kind of local environment because that information isn't there. Similarly, for different kind of minority languages, it might not be very good at communicating in those. It tends to have a kind of a hegemonic viewpoint because that is what is available for the training. Another example, I have another colleague of mine who works in genocide studies, finds it very hard to get good information from the tools or use them for her area because a lot of the tools have been trained where that is kind of a guardrail, and genocide, it won't deal with the term genocide or come up with that. So again, it's kind of what is excluded from these tools can inform that bias just as much as what is included. So just to give a quick example of what this looks like or how it plays out, generally, I think the images are a good or easy way to kind of illustrate bias and have conversations about it. It could be a good thing to do with students as well to illustrate that. So here is a few examples from a prompt I put in, create an image of an Irish teacher. So you can see there what they all look like. Inadvertently, in this case, there is kind of a gender bias. They've all come out as male. I don't think that would always be the case. It might just depend on the day or what it's choosing to produce. I have seen plenty of images where they are women as well. But you can get a sense from that where it's picking up on certain stereotypes that are out there to create this image to kind of use those identifiers as Irish. And I think this becomes almost even clearer in the text version of describing an image that you might create with this prompt, where you see there, so the teacher is described as having red hair and glasses, a kind of cozy sweater. It's a traditional Irish feeling classroom where you have the old-fashioned blackboard, the map of Ireland, and then you're looking out the window at the rolling hills and so forth. So again, you can clearly see in there what it's picking up, that a lot of kind of stereotypical versions of Ireland to create that. So the other thing to be aware of then is misinformation. So as opposed to disinformation, misinformation is not that it's deliberately being spread, but that generative AI does produce incorrect information from time to time because it is not thinking for itself. It is using those algorithms in the predictive fashion to create what is the most probable outcome. So if it doesn't know something, it will still create something, and it will sound very confident in doing so. This is what generally people refer to as hallucinations. I think now people are starting to call them mirages. But I was recently just last week, I was at a conference where the keynote speaker kind of used a metaphor to describe working with generative AI as like having a smart, biased, supremely confident, drunk intern. So this is from Dr. Punya Mishra. You can see more about that on his blog there. But I thought this was a good way of kind of capturing it and explaining how this misinformation kind of occurs in it. So it is capable of producing quite accurate information at times. It is smart, but it has those biases. It's always very confident in what it produces, but it can make mistakes, basically. So a good way of thinking about working with it is that it's most helpful really when you already know an area quite well, and then you're going to it for that kind of assistance, but then you can spot easily enough where those errors do occur. And this is why it's important to evaluate, fact check the outputs, use multiple sources, and then consider the context if there's different perspectives. All of these kind of key things to how we work with information generally. So just to give an example then of how this information might happen. So here we have an example of where I prompted it to say, I've assigned it the role of a journalist and asked it to write a short news article. Now, to be fair to it, in this case, I didn't say it had to be factually accurate. So it has produced essentially a fictional news article here. But you can see that if this was then posted somewhere else, it has the structure and look of a real article. It has quotes in it from people. It refers to companies. It could easily be, if someone took it as a news article and didn't fact check it, that it was a news article. Most commonly, you see kind of references to these hallucinations and things in terms of references it provides, that it will often make up a reference, or it will, include a reference from a real author, but the title of the book isn't something that exists, or the book is there, but that article isn't in it, so it can't quite piece together those pieces of information. So again, so here's the story that it's created. It's talking about an AI-powered search engine that a tech giant is creating. And the company is Nexus AI. The CEO, Emily Carter, has quotes from her about what this new tool is going to do. So I thought it was interesting when I went to kind of just fact check this, and I just did a search for Nexus AI and also Emily Carter. I found there is a company called Nexus AI. Emily Carter is not the CEO. She's not linked to it. They're not working on this tool that's coming out. But what did come up was these two books that were on Apple Books and Amazon Kindle books, both to do with AI. And you can see, hopefully you can read the text there, that both of them refer to a Dr. Emily Carter and a Nexus AI, either a new tool Nexus or a company Nexus AI. So I think this is just interesting in that it kind of shows how information is working with this, so that either maybe the generative AI tool ChatGPT pulled some of this from these, or perhaps these used generative AI to write some of the text for them, and you start to see that thread line of Emily Carter and Nexus AI, even though these are all fictional pieces of work. So again, just to illustrate kind of why it is important to fact check and look for that misinformation piece and discuss this with students. So the next big area then is copyright and intellectual property. So there's a great number of lawsuits currently ongoing that will probably decide, once based on their outputs or outcomes, how copyright law is going to shape up and look now with generative AI in the mix. So they might have an impact on what is considered fair use. So a lot of these are currently ongoing. So copyright law and regulation around this is still kind of in the process of being decided. And again, these lawsuits will probably have an impact. Two of the probably best known ones are New York Times suing OpenAI, which is the kind of parent company of ChatGPT, and also Copilot, in that they found that the tools trained on a lot of their copyrighted subscription-only content, and then they were then able to output very similar kind of verbatim passages from that content by using certain prompts to generate that out, which illustrated that it had been trained on those. again, OpenAI and the companies are arguing that this is kind of fair use of what's available online, that they can take it and use it as their training. Getty Images then, so we have another one that's more specific to the imagery side of things. Getty Images have their kind of curated collection of copyrighted images that Stability AI, company that uses Stable Diffusion, accessed for its training data. And you can see then in the outputs there, what you see there is that it's even outputting that kind of Getty Images watermark as part of the output. So again, proof that it has used these things. So generally, this is, again, we're not quite sure everything that's gone into these tools. We do know copyrighted material has gone into training them and can come out in outputs. So this raises questions, I suppose, ethical questions about the use, and is it kind of second-degree plagiarism if we're using it? How does that work? But there's two kind of important things for us to bear in mind, I guess, in terms of copyright and our own intellectual property when using the tools. One to do with what we're inputting, and then one to do with what we're doing with what is output. So in terms of what we're inputting, just be very careful about putting in any copyrighted material, because a lot of the tools do train on the chats that we have with them as well and what we input into them, unless you're using a version that has protection against that, so where your data isn't going into the chat. So we shouldn't be putting copyrighted material in. We shouldn't be putting the work of others in without their permission. And also we need to be aware of our own research. If you're, I suppose, just be very careful about putting any of your own research in, if you haven't already published it and so forth, because there are questions around the intellectual property there, and that once it's gone in and it's gone into that training and it can be output for someone else, you might not kind of retain that intellectual property. So this is a general kind of guidance as well in terms of sensitive information, private information. Just be careful about inputting things like that into these tools. And then in terms of the output, generally copyright requires to have something copyrighted requires a human author or producer. And this is what's kind of being upheld at the moment in terms of copywriting content produced by generative AI, that it cannot be copyrighted. If you have significantly edited the output from generative AI, you can copyright your own pieces of that work, but still not what was produced by generative AI itself. So this is just something to bear in mind if, for example, you're using generative AI images or videos in a presentation or in a publication, that piece of the work may not be able to be copyrighted. So again, just something to bear in mind depending upon the type of use that you might have. And then our last bit then is looking at kind of the environmental impact. So it's particularly in the training of these tools that has the largest environmental impact, but then also in maintaining them and all the data centers for them. So there's a generally high energy and water use for this. So just to kind of some examples to showcase this is ChatGPT's daily power use is equivalent to 180,000 US households, and a kind of general conversation that you might have with ChatGPT is equivalent to one small bottle of water. The amount of energy drawn use varies depending upon what types of tasks you're doing. So image generation, for example, you can see kind of on the graph here, that was some research done by researchers who are calling to have a kind of energy rating or energy footprint put onto these tools, similar to what you would have with light bulbs and so forth, to showcase the use. Their research shows image generation requires a lot more energy than, say, text generation. So the type of task you're doing does play into this. And again, it's also depends on, a lot of it is more for the training than the general use. But generally, any kind of use of these tools does require more energy than using a general search engine. So what this means is that just kind of being intentional about our use of these, so that we're actually getting some sort of value out of using them. We're not just using them for the sake of it. If it's a general search that can be done just using a search engine, then use that instead, and think about how you're using these. And part of the reason I'm drawing attention to all of these ethical concerns is that these are areas that were highlighted by students and by staff in the surveys as kind of areas of concern. So they are something to be thinking about, particularly the environmental impact and copyright. There were several students who stated they did not want to engage with these tools because of these areas. that could be the minority of people, but it is still something to bear in mind and something for us to think about as we're using the tools to make sure we are using them responsibly. So a general kind of checklist then to think about, I suppose, before you're thinking about using a particular tool is what kind of tasks do you want to use it for? And is it adding value to your work in doing so? So once you've established that, think about what type of tool you want to use. Is it just a general tool that you need? Do you need something that's more specific to a certain area, like, again, creating a podcast or creating a presentation? There are specific tools that are kind of more focused on those things. Also, then, are you aware how the tool uses your data and what you should and should not input into it? Are there any institutional guidelines on this, which there might be if you're using it for work purposes? So I'm just drawing attention here to Copilot, which, again, I think our institution has some access to, which has this protected access. I assume any other institutions using Microsoft Outlook and so forth will have this as well. So you can see there with the little arrows pointing that kind of green checkmark badge. If you're logged in with your institutional account, that will show up, and that protects the data within that enterprise, so it's not going into the general training pool. Now, this may or may not matter depending upon if you're using very basic prompts to do very general tasks. It might not matter to you if it goes into the training or not. But if you're doing something that's a little bit more specific, or if you don't want to go into the training data, that's just something to bear in mind and look at how these tools are working. And then it's thinking about what you want to do with the output. And depending on what you're using it for, you run into copyright issues and understanding your responsibility in dealing with that output, so that there is a need to kind of evaluate and edit. And potentially you might need to acknowledge that use, and how will you do so? Particularly, I suppose, if we're asking students to acknowledge their use, it's a kind of good practice then we acknowledge ours in modeling that for them as well. Again, depending upon what the outputs are being used for. So now we've gone through kind of what to know before you use it. You have that kind of checklist thinking about, what do you need to be prepared for when you're using it. So now we're going to look at what you need to know when you're using it. And this is where I'll get into some different examples of how people have used it as well. So I'm just quickly going to go over prompting and then evaluating the outputs, and then we'll get into those examples. So prompting, you might have heard the term kind of prompt engineering, things like that. I don't think we all need to be necessarily experts in prompting. Anyone can the tools are fairly straightforward to use. If you haven't used them already, the chat functionality is quite straightforward. But there are some general tips in terms of prompting that will get you a better output. So it is a case of kind of what you put in can direct what you get out. And if you put in something very general, you might get a very general response that's not quite suited for your purposes. So providing clear instructions and being specific is helpful. Think about, what do you want the tool to do? Do you want it to explain something, summarize something, create something, outline? Think about putting those kind of verbs in there. Do you want that output in a particular style or tone? Is there a particular word length that needs to be? Give these kind of details. It is possible to assign a role or kind of persona to the tool. So for example, you're a tutor for Leaving Cert students studying history, and then go into that you want it to quiz you or something like that. Generally write in plain language and break larger tasks up into subtasks. Provide any kind of context information that's needed for what you're looking to get out. Potentially reference text, but bearing in mind that kind of copyright and privacy considerations, that you're not inputting kind of sensitive information or copyrighted material in there. And then, because it is an iterative process, and you can have that conversation, refine and follow up as needed. So my colleagues in the library here have adapted this. They made it kind of simplified all of this into the CLEAR framework. So think about being concise, logical, explicit, adaptive, and reflective. And those last 2 points there, again, are hinting at the point that this is an iterative process. So you might need to adapt what you've input there, reflect on what you have done, and see, if you need to fine tune it or tweak it to get more specific results. So just to look at some examples of these to highlight kind of what level of specificity might be helpful. So in all of these examples, I have what's there in italics is a kind of general prompt that you might throw in that would give a result, but it might be too broad. And then this is then specified or made more specific in the what's there in bold. So for example, if you're summarizing significant events in Irish history, this could give you, a general time, any kind of time span. It might be very broad. If you want something more specific, you might say summarize significant events in Irish history between 1890 and 1920, provide a timeline of these events with a bullet point for each that explains why it is significant. So you can see then you're going to get your more specific result out of that. Similarly, for if you're using it for help with using Excel, instead of just asking about to add a row up, ask it very specifically what you want done. So how do I add up a row of euro amounts in Excel? I want to do this for 3 consecutive rows with all of the totals appearing to the right in a column called total spend. Similarly, then looking at assigning it roles. So this is where you might assign it kind of a particular tone or a style. So if you're a film critic with a humorous tone to write a review of a film, or if you're wanting it to help you as a kind of study partner, instead of just having it quiz you on neuroanatomy, you can assign it the role of a tutor, explain what level of study you're at, and then do a very specific aspect of what you want to be studying. Okay, so then you've put your prompt in, you've got your output. In terms of evaluating that, this is very much just using existing approaches for evaluating information. So for example, the CRAP test, that's there. It's just reiterating the importance of doing this, that we can't necessarily take what's output at face value. So looking at currency, the timeliness of the information, is it relevant to what you've asked and kind of what you're looking for, what you need? If not, you might need to go back, fine tune the prompt a bit. How accurate, how reliable and correct is the information, fact checking, the authority, where is the source? So some of these, I think the one difference between using these kind of existing methods on this type of information versus more traditional information searches is that it can be harder to kind of discern some of these elements. So you might not know exactly the source of the information. Sometimes references will be included. Again, sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're not. And you might not necessarily know how current it is other than knowing what the latest version of training the tool has had. So that's where you might need to dig a bit deeper, think about it differently. So the purpose, what is the purpose? And then I've added objectivity here, just to, again, highlight the fact of that bias, and then we need to be aware of that. So the important thing really to remember is that generative AI does not take responsibility for its outputs. And actually, a lot of the chats will have a little disclaimer in them itself that says that they can produce incorrect information and to always check for important uses. But because we ultimately do take responsibility when we're using those outputs. Okay, so this is some of the information from the surveys that I ran then to look at what are particular uses that people are currently using it for. And then we'll go into some examples of kind of the staff use on the teaching side. So I've broken up the staff use into the top areas are more kind of general purpose administrative or research uses, and then the bottom ones under the line are related to kind of teaching and pedagogical uses. So generally might be summarizing meeting notes or large documents, generating ideas, revising writing as a general kind of research assistant with literature reviews and so on, creating tables or structuring or organizing information, producing text for marketing and images for marketing, and then also for emails or checking kind of the tone of an email for a particular purpose. Again, producing images for presentations, and then help with coding questions. And then uses that are particular to kind of teaching is teaching prep, outlining lectures, generating MCQ banks or quizzes, trying out assessment design. So that's a big one, is people checking how secure their assessment is by inputting it into generative AI and seeing what it comes up with. And also maybe asking for suggestions, and creating rubrics, creating educational resources, and creating exemplars, case studies, templates, things like that to use in the classroom. And then the student use, you can see, is similar. So the student survey question had a specific question which gave kind of options, whereas the staff one was an open-ended question people were typing in. So I've summarized there. In the student one, then you can get a sense of how many are using it for which tasks. So the most is for summarizing information and clarifying complex topics. And then it's used for searching for information, brainstorming, editing, writing, creating study plans, and then much lower is kind of producing images, video, audio, and actually completing parts of an assignment. So from this, you can see a lot of the tasks it's being used for, and a lot of what is quite more beneficial for, I suppose, are the kind of planning stages of things, early stages of things, which is where you might be kind of bringing together that information, coming up with ideas, structuring things, studying, all of those pieces, and that's kind of similar across both areas. So what are some examples then of how you might use it to help you with kind of teaching, planning, and so forth? So one is creating a rubric. So generative AI is quite good at structuring content. It kind of understands those structures, and it's good at creating quickly things that are very structured types of documents. So you can see here, I asked it to create a rubric for Irish oral communications that includes grammatical accuracy, pronunciation, and fluency. And this is what it outputs very, very quickly. And I did not edit this at all, so you can get a sense of what it does kind of in its immediacy. You might then want to go in and edit some of these categories, put in more specifics for your particular assignment. But this can be a really good way of kind of very quickly getting a starting point for something like this. And then, again, going back and making adjustments as needed. Another example here is from an example of kind of creating a quiz. And this one I've thrown in as a bit of a red herring because there is an error within this. So this is, again, just to illustrate that it is important to double check. So it is quite good, again, at producing these things as a first point, but it's important that we check them. So here you can see the example of that it's a teacher for Irish history students wants to create a quiz with 5 questions on the topic, and then specifying each question must have 4 answers only, one of which is correct. So it's produced 5 questions. I'm just including one here for the sake of this. And the question here is, which Irish leader was imprisoned in 1916 but later became the first president of Ireland? So if any of you were kind of history in the area of history, you might spot a possible issue with this. If not, we can see that it has the correct answer is Eamon de Valera, and this is a correct answer, but there is another answer that could be counted as correct in this question, and that's Arthur Griffith. So he did not take part in the 1916 Easter Rising, but he was imprisoned in 1916 in its aftermath, and then he did serve as president of Dáil Éireann in 1922. So this is where, again, it's just important to maybe go in and tweak some of these things and do that checking. And again, where it's that idea of kind of, if you're already kind of the expert in this area, you might spot these things quite easily. It doesn't take a lot of work to fix them. If you're a student studying and you're not as familiar, this is where kind of issues can arise if fact checking isn't used in conjunction with this. And then the other example I'm going to share is that kind of creating educational resources, and one of which might be a case study. So this is something that 2 of my colleagues here at UCC have done, João Costa and João Mota. They're in our School of Education. So they prompted ChatGPT to write a problem with a specific pedagogical approach. So for example, adventure education. And then they assessed this in terms of its validity, authenticity, and then asked it to convert this into a case study format, which then again adopts that kind of clear structure, including a background and a problem section. Again, it's good at these kind of structures. And then they went through and kind of manually extracted the most relevant features and condensed this into a case study that they could use. So I have just an example of kind of this. So they have the output there on the left, and then what's highlighted in green is what they've kind of pulled out of that to put into their own case study. And they went back and kind of refined the process, refined their prompts for this, and found that they were able to then, much quicker than they would have if they were writing all of these case studies on their own, were able to create 5 case studies in the space of an hour by kind of using this method and approach. So again, another good example of ways that it can be used usefully and responsibly there. So this example, along with many others, you can find in this recent publication, so using generative AI in teaching, learning, and assessment in Irish universities. So I was one of the co-editors from UCC for this. And it was a partnership between 7 universities in Ireland, or institutions in Ireland, where we pulled, there's over 30 case studies or showcases of use in all. And these range from using these tools for research purposes, searching for information, generating kind of abstracts and proposal titles, things like that, to also using it in assessments themselves, or designing assessments around the use of them. And also to design the educational materials, to co-create rubrics with students, all of these things. So I've shared a few little examples today, and the one I just talked about with creating the case studies is included in here. If you want to see more information on that or more examples of other uses, I'd recommend looking into that there. So now to our last section for today is what to know about generative AI in assessment. So I'm just going to touch upon academic integrity here, thinking about integrating it or not, and then some examples again from what people have done with this. So again, the tools themselves are not inherently bad or good. They're not inherently against or helping academic integrity either. So there are challenges, and this is a big topic that has come up since these tools have come out. There are lots of challenges around the use of them to bypass learning, the misrepresentation of AI-generated content as individuals' own work, and unethical or irresponsible and inappropriate use of generative AI. But there are also potential opportunities where they might be used to enhance learning, or where they could be brought into activities where you're starting to develop a kind of critical AI literacy or learning how to use the tools responsibly. Potentially there's an increased efficiency in using them or different new approaches that can be taken with them. I have question marks there because there's not necessarily evidence for this at the moment. It's something that people are starting experimenting with. And there are uses where you might actually be decreasing efficiency or losing out on learning. So they're not good for everything. But they might be good for some things. That's essentially it. So thinking about it that way. Again, I'm not advocating that they need to be used or that they definitely shouldn't be used. I think there's probably a middle ground somewhere in there. I don't think we all need to become AI experts, or all need to develop or teach critical AI literacy in every course. But because they are so ubiquitous and because so many people are using them, both our staff and student surveys had, I think, about 70–80% of people have used them to some degree. It is important to at least be aware of these things and think about them and structure what we're doing around that to some degree. So the approach I generally take in terms of academic integrity is one that's focused on that academic integrity side rather than the academic misconduct side. So it's a proactive kind of preventative approach to dealing with this. So we know, AI detectors can be a somewhat controversial topic at times. Generally, the AI detectors are not valid enough as evidence because there are too many cases of false positives or false negatives. So they're not on their own a valid form of evidence. There's no way, unlike a Turnitin report, a general Turnitin report, where you can see the highlighted text, you can see where things have come from. AI detectors are just giving you a percentage, and there's no real way to kind of dig into that. Equally, we shouldn't be putting students' work into any third-party tools. There are tons of AI detector tools out there online. Some of these can be connected to other companies that are connected to essay mills that then take that work and output it and use it for something for another purpose. So it's breaching GDPR and it's breaching kind of their privacy by putting work into those tools. So only if there's institutionally provided tool can it be run through that anyway. So this then presents challenges in terms of that detecting side of things, which means doesn't mean like do not do it at all. There are still kind of tells for these things, like, again, false references and so forth. But it's also useful then to focus on all of the other steps that we can take that are preventative. So this means kind of planning for integrity rather than reacting to misconduct, focusing from just catching cheating to looking at, are we evaluating if learning has occurred and how can we best do this? So this might mean focusing more on the learning process, looking at what the learning outcomes are, and linking this to assessment validity, making sure our assessment is designed to reflect that, and using a layered and kind of cumulative approach or method for this. So the Swiss cheese model is one way of looking at this, where you can see this comes up in academic integrity a lot, that enforcement is one stage of this. But there's all of these other stages around, creating the environment, the types of assessment, the educational piece. So all of these layers of cheese have kind of stacked up, and the more you have, the harder it is to get all the way through the whole to the end. So what I'm going to talk about quickly now is just some of those preventative steps, I suppose. And the first thing is around providing guidance. So in our survey, 40% of UCC students report being given guidance on generative AI, which means 60% have not. Out of those 40%, 65% felt that it was clear. And what was missing was clarity on when tools can and can't be used, how to reference, how assignments with different levels of generative AI will be marked, the ethical issues, how to use it effectively, how it can be detected, and disciplinary procedures, and then a sense of kind of consistency and visibility of any kind of policies or guidance. Because our university, probably like many others, the overall approach is that academic integrity is breached if generative AI use is unacknowledged and unauthorized, which then devolves it down to different schools, departments to determine if they want to be allowing students to use it, what level to use it or not. So this means that the majority of students are receiving guidance from their lecturers, as you can see there, which makes sense because that is where that kind of level of expectations needs to be set. So one thing that we can all do to kind of help address this is to write a generative AI statement for our course or for a particular assessment, which articulates the purpose of that assessment, relating it to learning outcomes, rubrics, and setting clear expectations around appropriate versus inappropriate use and explaining why. So it's not just the kind of making that statement, but that why piece kind of increases that transparency and illustrates why that assessment is important. Again, aligning with things like the learning outcomes rubrics and so forth. Also explain how to acknowledge use. There's no standard way of doing this necessarily. So do they need to submit some sort of statement? Do you want them to submit an original and revised version of work if they're allowed to use it for editing, for example? Do you want screenshots of the conversation? They should know this kind of in advance so that they can prepare that, and then make this accessible and have it somewhere on your course syllabus or your in the LMS, in assignment briefs, somewhere where it's very clear, and take the time to discuss it with them. So we have this resource that takes you through these steps on the toolkit, which I'll show you later as well. So you can always come back to that. The next thing is designing a rubric that demonstrates the priorities of the learning. If you're not using generative AI, you don't want students to use generative AI, make sure you're looking at giving weight to tasks that generative AI does not do well without critical intervention. So think about, again, what is particularly important that they're learning for that course that they don't use it for, and putting the weight on that rather than other areas. And then integration. So if you are integrating it, make sure, there should be a reason why it's being integrated. They're expected to learn something from that. So illustrate what those expectations are in the rubric as well. And as we've seen, generative AI can help kind of create rubrics. So that's a starting point where you can maybe more quickly develop a rubric where it can be useful to provide this kind of guidance. In terms of assessment then, so again, when you're designing your assessment, think back to that, writing that statement, understanding what the learning outcomes are, how does assessment align with those, what's the best way to measure this, what skills do students need to demonstrate on their own or not, and then think about what level of generative AI would be acceptable for that. So here we can see the staff and the student versions of what level they think should be allowed, and they're actually quite similar. In fact, the lecturers, a larger percent of lecturers felt that to produce content that could be in the final submission with acknowledgement would be allowed, but generally both students and staff felt it was kind of, again, more those beginning stages for the planning stages where no AI generated content is in the assessment, but that it's used for those planning stages or to help with clarifying written content, editing that content. So quickly, some examples of what people have done for this in ways that use it kind of critically, bearing in mind that you cannot require students to sign up for a third-party tool. So think about if you have access, say, to Copilot or not, or consider alternatives for students who object. But one assessment example from business information systems, there's 3 stages to their assignment. So they chose, first was to choose a local SME, interview the manager, analyze the current business model, then the students to propose their own business model for future growth, and then prompt generative AI on current and future business models and kind of do a comparison between them. So this is integrating it, looking at critical use, and still doing their own work as well. For learning activity and applied psychology, again, inputting hypothetical vignettes as prompts and then critically analyzing the output, comparing with their own work to identify any kind of gaps in responses based on analysis of their own evidence base and reflective practice. And this was also encouraging students to think critically about what is safe for service users in terms of what's being input and how this might be used in kind of health fields. And then finally, an assessment in philosophy. So this is actually a philosophy of artificial intelligence course. But a general kind of explain and evaluate essay on the Turing test was adapted to conduct a Turing test with generative AI and then evaluate this, including screenshots of the conversation. And then this again was very practical because they were both learning about the topic and the technology as they were using it. So all of those examples, you can find more information about them in the toolkit for the ethical use of generative AI that I worked on as part of my project in the previous year. There's case studies within that, and then again, there's case studies within the other resource I shared of the Irish universities as well that go more into detail on some of these things. Other things to think about just in terms of possible learning activities student uses or potentially that came out of that project as well were using templates to demonstrate kind of structure for students or samples to critique and evaluate, kind of challenging generative AI, identifying gaps in its information by, again, evaluating, looking at kind of role play scenarios, maybe an interview or a client, or using it as a study buddy or to create study resources like a timetable, study plan, and so forth. So that is it, a very big overview. Lots of things to include in introducing this, but I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing. Hopefully that's been helpful. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Loretta. That was really good. Really appreciate it. Very informative. If anybody has a question, they can put it in the chat and I can read it out. We do have a question from Dana Madden, and she asks, would all this info be valid for DeepSeek as well?
So all this info, I guess, is that the ethical concerns piece, or, I mean, I suppose generally, yes, it would it would all apply because this is generally about kind of using them tools responsibly and bearing in mind where, how they were trained, how the data is used. So it would apply to that. That model may have been trained differently than ChatGPT, of course. So it would be, if you're looking at a specific tool or model, you'd want to kind of look into how that one specifically was trained and what it does. But it is a general kind of LLM tool like ChatGPT, so it functions in a similar way. But again, the data part is a bit different potentially.
Okay, thank you. We just have a question saying, will there be a recording be available? Yes, there'll be a recording available, and I will send a link to the recording once we have it up and running. Okay. And if there's any other questions? No? Okay, it doesn't seem to be any other questions at the moment.
I think there's a hand up.
Oh, there's a hand up, sorry. Let's see. Oh, yes, I'm just going to, Martin O'Grady, I'm just going to unmute you there, just one moment. Go ahead, whenever you're ready. Hello, Martin.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I put in, I was just typing up a question there in the chat. I can state it. I was just going to ask if for assessment purposes, an approach might be used where students are asked to evaluate or critique an output that they've generated through generative AI. could they not then get the generative AI to do that critique and evaluation?
Yes, I suppose it would be possible to run that back through and come out with something. So yeah, in terms of securing assessment, I suppose for things like that, if it is very open, it's about, again, setting the expectations. It's not going to stop everyone from doing it. So the idea is, I suppose, to set it up so that students see the value in the piece that they're meant to be doing on their own and why they're meant to be doing it on their own. Again, that's not going to stop everyone. So it is possible. If someone kind of wants to cheat through an assessment, they will find a way, I think. And that's the case even before generative AI. But with generative AI, it's a lot easier to do that if someone is kind of determined that they're going to cheat. There are tons of tools that you can spin things through and do things with. So if there's a piece that needs to be very secure like that, there could be an element of that. They're doing some of that in the classroom, maybe, or having conversations with their fellow students in that evaluation process, or evaluating it through a conversation with you, or something like a different element to really prevent it being used for that. Hopefully that answers the question. So yeah, it is definitely possible, and there are different measures you can take to kind of, again, each step reduces the likelihood that someone would do that. But you do need to kind of maybe think creatively about how that would be done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi has a question. She asks, I'm wondering about sustainability reporting considerations. Given public bodies, including education institutions, must report on energy usage, do you think that down the road bodies might be expected to report on student-prescribed AI use? Or
it's hard for me to to necessarily answer that with any kind of sense of authority. I would say, I mean, at the moment, it would be very difficult to do that because they're not necessarily using any tools through the university. It's kind of in their own time. There wouldn't be a way necessarily to track how much energy they're using by using it. If it reached a stage where universities, and I know some universities in the US are adopting or working in partnership, say with Microsoft or OpenAI, to create a kind of bespoke tool that they are using and that they're providing to all staff and students, that would be much easier, I think, to report on. So if it reached a stage where there was something like that being used, potentially, but otherwise, in terms of energy use, I think, I mean, you'd only really be capturing general energy use from what's used on campus. I don't think there would be a way necessarily to easily report that in the near future, anyway. That would be my guess, anyway. I'm not, I wouldn't be at the level of deciding on those reports, but.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, brilliant. We're just out of time. I just want to thank Loretta. That was an excellent talk. Really, really enjoyed it. And again, like I mentioned, we're going to be sending, I'll send a link to the video once we have it ready to go. We will be having another talk. Our second talk will be looking at navigating academic integrity and ethics in AI. And that'll be done by Mary Claire Kennedy from UL. She would be the academic integrity officer there. So again, I'll send out the link for that. So keep watching that space. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Loretta. You're very good, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.